Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf lamed aleph. Actually, a little bit of simpler and shorter daf, which is nice. I just want to mention before class that I will be in Chicago in 2 weeks, and I'll be teaching there on February 24th. So if anybody's around in Chicago and wants to join the shiur, you can reach out to us for the details. We sent it in the Chicago group, but if you're not in the Chicago group, the WhatsApp group, you might want to join it if you live there, and it'll be in Skokie. I'm really looking forward to seeing learners there. Okay, I'm going to give a pre-Purim shir relating to Mishloach Manot and how it developed throughout the, one of those classic, here's what the Gemara says, here's how the Gemara can be read in multiple ways, here's alternative sources, and how does that pan out in what we do. Okay, with that, we will get started with our daf. So we're in the middle of Rabbi Shimon Shezuri. We have this statement, and this is really what we're focusing on. Statement of Ravin, the son of Chinina, who said in the name of Ulla, who said in the name of Rabbi Chanina, that we paskin, like Rabbi Shimon Shezuri, in this case, which we're trying to figure out and identify what is this case. And in fact, not only that, but we also paskin like him everywhere else. So it's interesting, the Gemara, which is an interesting question in the first place, why this is interesting then, but what is the original case that they hold like Rabbi Shimon Shezuri in, that Ravin anyway, Rabbi Chanina says that Rabbi Chanina held like Rabbi Shimon Shezuri and paskin like they originally before he made the general rule. So first we thought it was maybe our case, which was all about erasing the name of God. When you don't have the name of God in a Sefer Torah, if you forgot it, what are the methods for possibly fixing it? And Rabbi Shimon Shezuri said you can put it in the in-between line as long as it's the complete name of God. But we basically rejected a whole series of possibilities because each time we said, it lists there who paskins like who, and notice Ravin Bar Chinina is not quoted there as quoting Ulla, who quotes Rabbi Chanina, saying the halakha is like Rabbi Shimon Shezuri. So now we're going to end this section, or almost end, then we're going to start another part relating to Rabbi Shimon Shezuri. But by the way, I checked out his name. Shezuri, Lishazer is to intertwine. He was a person who made ropes, and that's why he was called Rabbi Shimon Shezuri, according to what I found. Anyway, that's just in terms of his name. Now we're going to go back to understanding where was this statement made that he paskins like Rabbi Shimon Shezuri. Ella Amar Rav Papa, we're at the very bottom of Lamed Amud Bet. Ella Amar Rav Papa Ashida. Rav Yitzchak Amar Ayayin. So Rav Papa says it was about the shida, which is like a box, a chest. And Rav Yitzchak said it was about wine. Now we're going to go into each case, and these are going to be two possibilities to answer our question. Rav Papa Amar Hashida Ditnan. There was a Mishnah in Kalim that says Hashida. Now, a shida, like I said, is a chest. Now it's kind of big. Big question is, where's the border between a vessel and not a vessel? In Masechet Kalim, it's all about what is susceptible to impurity. To be susceptible to impurity, you have to be called a kli. A kli is something that can be picked up and moved. So at what point does a vessel become too big that it's no longer a vessel and no longer susceptible to impurity? So Beit Shammai omrim nimdedet mibifnim. So he says, when you have this big chest, okay, now before you even get here, you have to understand, which is the measurement they use is 40 se'ah. Where do we know that measurement from? From a mikvah, right? A mikvah is 40 se'ah. That's the minimum measurement. Here we're talking about the maximum measurement for a vessel is 40 se'ah. As soon as it gets to 40 se'ah, you've gone over, it's no longer a vessel, which means that it won't be susceptible to impurity. So let's say a person who's impure to a dead body comes over and touches the vessel, it's not impure. So Beit Shammai says, how do we measure it? The simple way you would have thought to measure it, you measure how much you can put inside this chest. And if you got to 40 se'ah, okay, it's no longer susceptible to impurity. Beit Hillel omrim mi bachutz. Beit Hillel say we measure it including also the outside. Okay, we kind of say as if the outside was invisible, right, was not there. We include that in the measurement, which is actually a lenient position, because the more you include, you can get to 40 se'ah more quickly, right? So he's going to say we measure even the outside space of the vessel. Umodim elu ve'elu. Now they both agree she'ein ovi ha'raglayim ve'ovi halav zivizid nimdad. Now they both agree that you don't count the thickness of the legs and the thickness of the frame that's around it in the measurement. Okay, those two parts don't count. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Modidim she'ovi ha'raglayim ve'ovi halav zivizim nimdad. Rabbi Yossi says, what are you talking about? Of course they both agree that that's part of the vessel. Of course, that's measured. But beinehem em nimdad. But the space in between the legs, right, like under this chest, let's say it has legs on it and there's empty space. Of course, the empty space doesn't count. Here comes in Rav Shimon Shezuri. Remember, the more you count, the more lenient we're going to get, because you're going to get to a higher shear, right? The 40 say, more quickly, and then say, this is not susceptible to impurity. Rabbi Shimon Shezuri Omer, imayu raglayim gvohot tefach, ein beinehem nimdad. If they were tefach, then if they were already one hand's breadth, then they're already significant enough. They stand on their own, and then we're just going to count those parts and not the in-between space. V'im lav, but if not, beinehem nimdad. But if not, we're going to count the in-between space, because then the whole thing becomes, each of those legs is not significant enough in and of itself, or neither is the frame, and therefore it's all considered, that and the space in between it is all considered part of the measurement. How does this relate to other things Rabbi Shimon Shezuri says? Well, first of all, he's more lenient here, and he seems to be taking a more lenient position in many of the cases. We also called him yesterday a problem solver. Right? You're in a situation, you're stuck. This isn't exactly in a situation stuck. But perhaps I thought about it more since yesterday, and I think that we can also use this term, a halachic term called an umdana. And I think that Rabbi Shimon Shezuri, in most of his opinions, not all of them, but most of them, he employs this tactic, which is umdana, which is we look at something as if it is, even though it's not really, okay, or even though it's not clear, okay, like the misukan with the get, okay, where he said write the get, and he must have meant give the get, and he's just going to be more lenient about when we can employ use of that. Likewise here. The space in between is not really the vessel. On the other hand, we view it as if it's the vessel. Okay? We saw it with let's just go back to another one with the Trumat Maaser, right? What did we say? We don't really know for sure. We can't really trust it on Ma'aretz, but we can view it once they say, right? In a unique case, when you're stuck, we can ask them and we can trust them even though we're not really sure. Okay, so these are ways of basically employing a tactic called umdana, which is let's just assume that this is, even though we're not really sure it is, or let's view something as something even though it's not necessarily in reality that way. Okay, we're going to finish with our last one now, which is a little bit similar also, a completely different topic. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak amar ayayin ditnan. Rabbi Meir omer shemen tchila la'olam. Oil is considered a rishon always. What does this mean? This is a very unique situation of mashkin. It's a unique kind of tumah called tumah mashkin. The rabbis were strict and said that any time a liquid, usually the way tumah works, it's very organized. An av touches a person or a vessel, makes it a rishon. A rishon touches food or drink, makes it a sheni. A sheni can make a shlishi if it's truma or kodshim, and a shlishi can make a ravi. Okay, and it just goes down. Everything that touches it goes down a level. But the rabbis made this special decree about mashkin, liquids, and said that the liquid actually always is a rishon. So if, let's say, a rishon touched a liquid, it normally would make it a sheni, but no, the liquid becomes a rishon and passes on impurity as well. Okay, so that's a specific chumrah about liquids. So now he says, shemen tchila la'olam. So shemen will always be a rishon, not just water, let's say, also oil. Chachamim omrim af hadvash. The rabbis say even honey. Honey, obviously, you could say why could be sort of between a liquid and a solid. Rabbi Shimon Shezuri omer af hayayin. He adds even wine. This is a bit of a strange statement. The Gemara says, Michal Tanakam savar yayin lo. Wait, but wine's pretty much liquid, right? You think Tanakam said oil is going to say, but not wine, and only Rabbi Shimon Shezuri adds wine. So Rabbi Shimon Shezuri omer say that Rabbi Shimon Shezuri omer yayin. He says only wine. Okay, in other words, he doesn't think oil, he doesn't think honey, which fits in with Rabbi Shimon Shezuri being the more lenient one, right? The rereading of this in the beginning, it sounded like he was the most strict. Now he's being the most lenient by saying only wine, not these other substances. Now, some of the rabbis say, what are we talking about? Why do you even have to mention wine? Of course, it's a liquid. And so some of the commentaries understand here that we're talking about all of this is if they're in solid form. Okay, what if they became, cooked and thickened and basically turned into a solid? do we still view them as a liquid or not? And then Rabbi Shimon Shezuri says only wine we view as a liquid, not all the others. Okay, and then maybe that would make a little more sense in terms of this, because otherwise these should clearly be liquids, and why are we having a discussion about them? Okay, in any case, it's a little different than the others in terms of, but again, it's viewing something, especially if you understand it's talking about in its solid form, we still view it somewhat as a liquid, although here everybody somewhat does, so it's a little different than the others. Okay, Tanya, and we still have the Ben Pekua, which is definitely very different than all the others as well. Tanya, Amar Rabbi Shimon Shezuri. Now we're done with, we found an answer to where we assume that this original psak of Rabbi Chanina was said about. We have one of two possibilities, either on the shida or on the wine. Now we bring a braita with a story that Rabbi Shimon Shezuri tells of a case that happened to him, and he went to his rabbi. We're going to learn now his rabbi was Rabbi Tarfon. Tanya Amar Rabbi Shimon Shezuri. Pam achat nitarev li tevel b'chulin. One time I had a problem. My tevel, my tithe produce, got mixed up with untithed produce. Now that's a major problem. Why? Because if you want to take truma and masro now, and you don't know which is which, you now have a mixture. The majority is tithe, the minority is untithed, but now you can't say, oh, I'm going to take from some to fix the untithed produce, because that's a classic, min chayav ala patur, min patur ala chayav. We don't know which one you're taking, right? And you're going to end up taking perhaps from, right? Since you have both chiyuv and patur together, whatever you take is not going to work for part of it, right? If you take from, let's say, produce that's untithed, well, part of this produce is already tithed, and you can't take from tithed and untithed produce, and basically you're going to have a problem. If you take untithed, you take tithed produce already, you can't, that's patur, you can't take patur la patur. So what are you supposed to do? Ubati v'sha'alti Rabbi Tarfon, right? What are you supposed to do? Go ask your local rabbi. So he goes to Rabbi Tarfon, his rabbi, he says, what am I supposed to do? V'amar li, lech kach lecha min hashuk, v'aser alav. Go buy produce in the shuk. Who's selling produce in the shuk? Amei haaretz. Go buy stuff from Amei haaretz. What do we call that? Demai. We don't know if they really took Trumot Masrot. We don't trust them. We've talked about that. So even if they tell us they did, that doesn't really help us. Again, only in some unique circumstances, which we discussed. But you say, go buy from the shuk and aser alav. And then take maaser on your mixture. Why does that help? Kasaval must be he held deoraita beruba batel. The first thing we have to say is, we have a ta'arovet, right? We have a mixture. A little bit of untithed produce fell into a big amount of tithed produce. So now we're going to say, okay, well, does that untithed produce that fell in need to be meisered? Only by rabbinic law. Because by Torah law, batel barov, it's nullified in the majority. And since the majority is tithed, we should be okay. So only your obligation to fix this pile of mixture is only by rabbinic law. Now we can start to see where they're going. If we buy from the Amei haaretz in the shuk, what's that going to be? And what we have to get to is a stage where both piles have the same halachic status. So our original pile, where with the mixture, is now only obligated by rabbinic law. What about demai? Well, demai is obligated by rabbinic law as well, because rov Amei haaretz ma'asrin him. Most Amei haaretz do take maaser. We just have a concern that maybe they don't. And therefore, it's only obligated by rabbinic law to take the truma from there. And then it's perfect, because we have obligated by rabbinic law here, obligated by rabbinic law there. And therefore we say, it's like saying you're taking truma from the exempt on the exempt. Now, if it's exempt completely, you don't have to take. What they mean is exempt by Torah law and exempt by Torah law, but obligated only by rabbinic law. And then you can do it. So Rabbi Tarfon gives them a solution. Now the Gemara asks, "V'leimale kach mina goy or mina nochri." It depends whatever appears by you in your Gemara. The term always switches. By me it says goy. Anyway, they say, why don't we just have him buy from a non-Jew? Because also non-Jewish produce in Israel is also not obligated to be tithed by Torah law, only by rabbinic law. So, well, maybe yes, maybe no. That's what we're going to say right now. And all they're doing is saying, why didn't he give him another suggestion? That's not to say the suggestion he had wasn't good, but they were saying, why didn't you bring a different suggestion? And they're going to answer, because that wasn't a good suggestion, according to him. Because kasavar, now we're going to see there's a big machloket about this, what you do with a non-Jew who owns land in Israel, is it obligated to be tithed or not? So at first we thought it was by rabbinic law, but now they say no. Kasavar, Rabbi Tarfon must have held, in this big machloket that appears elsewhere, Ein kinyan legoy be'eretz Yisrael lafkia miyad ma'asil. If a Gentile buys land in Israel, it does not remove the obligation of the Trumah Masrot. The Trumah Masrot is on the land, not on the owner, according to this interpretation. And then, that wouldn't work then, because that's obligated by Torah law, and that wouldn't help our issue, which is obligated only by rabbinic law. And again, two different levels, you can't take one from on the other. That's version 1 of this sugya. Version 2 of the sugya is that the situation was the same situation, but the solution, the Rabbi Tarfon said, and now we're going to have the mirror image of the sugya, was the reverse. And what he said is, Ika de Amre, some people say that Amar Rabbi Tarfon said to him, Lech kach min hagoy, go take from a non-Jew. Go buy and do Trumah Masrot on it. Kasaval, he must have held in this version, Yesh kinyan legoy be'eretz Yisrael lafkia miyad ma'asil, v'havelei min hapatur lapatur. It must be that Rabbi Tarfon in this version held the opposite. That actually it does remove the obligation by Torah law to tithe the produce. You own, if a non-Jew buys it, if they buy the land, it's no longer obligated by Torah law because it goes by the owner, and therefore it's only obligated by rabbinic law. If you purchase from them, you have to take tithes by rabbinic law. So go buy from a non-Jew is what he told him, and that works to resolve this problem because now you have two piles of produce that are each obligated by rabbinic law, and that would work perfectly. So now, in this version, they're going to ask the opposite question. Why didn't he say go buy from the shuk? Kasavar ein rova me'aretz ma'asrin. Now we're going to say his assumption was the opposite of what we suggested before, which is he didn't think that was a good solution because he thinks that if you're talking about percentages, most amei haaretz don't take maser, which means that even though you're still not really obligated by Torah law, but it's much closer to a Torah obligation because it's much more likely you really are obligated, as opposed to this bundle, which is a mixture that was overpowered by the larger amount of tithe produce, and therefore you're only obligated by rabbinic law, and therefore we wouldn't use that. It wouldn't be a good solution because then you're not on equal footing in both places, in both piles. Okay, so there you have your two versions. In any case, what you have here is Rabbi Shimon Shezuri's rabbi, basically paskin for him, which then we assume Rabbi Shimon Shezuri holds that way, is also that you can fix, right? The big chiddush here is that there's a way to fix a mixture of tithed and untithed produce, as long as the majority is tithed. If your untithed produce fell into a pile of tithed produce, he has a solution. Again, we're back to saying, right, he comes up with solutions. We view this as if it's, again, an umdana. We make assumptions, okay, about this, we use laws of majority. We make assumptions about the amei haaretz, possibly, according to version 1. Anyway, we can resolve this issue. So now comes Rav Yemar, and he asks Rav Papa a question about this case. Shalach le Rav Yemar bar Shelamya le Rav Papa. Hada amar Ravin bar. So he sends a question to Rav Papa, and he says, Hada amar Ravin bar Chinina amar Ulla amar Rabbi Chanina halakha Rabbi Shimon Shezuri v'lo ela kol makom sheshana Rabbi Shimon Shezuri halakha k'moto. That whole thing that Rabbi Shimon Shezuri, that Ravin bar Chanina said about Rabbi Chanina's psak about Rabbi Shimon Shezuri, we pass like him all the time. Was that said about this as well? Okay, that's his question. Now, why would we distinguish? Well, we're going to see later that possibly the reason he thought to distinguish here was because this is the only source we saw where it's not a Mishnah, it's a Braita. All the other cases, Rabbi Shimon Shezuri appeared with his position in a Mishnah. Now, often the way they view Mishnayot is they have more stature to them and more status, and perhaps. So the question is, are we going to paskin like him in this Braita as well? Amar le'in. So he simply answers. Rav Papa says yes. So Amar Rav Ashi. Now later on, they have a discussion about this whole question that Rav Yemar bar Shelamya asked Rav Papa. Rav Ashi says that Amar li Mar Zutra. Okay, we're going to have this one quoting that one. So let's follow. Rav Ashi says that Mar Zutra told me that Kashe bar Rav Chanina Misura, that Rav Chanina Misura, and as Mar Zutra was explaining to Rav Papa that he heard Rav Chanina Misura ask a question on this whole scenario, and he said, Pshita, isn't it obvious? Isn't it very obvious that we paskin like Rav Shimon Shezuri? Mika Amar b'mishnatenu, turning now to Amabet, It never said anywhere that when Ravin, Bar Chanina quoted Rabbi Ulla, who quoted Rabbi Chanina, he never said, I paskin like Rabbi Shimon Shezuri every time it says so in the Mishnah. He just said anywhere where it said, right, where he taught. Lishnot is really from the language of Tana, Taf and Shin, switch in Aramaic. We're going to see that twice today. So Lishnot is, right, Mishnah or Braita, like Tanya, Braita, that's also Lishnot. Lishnot is in any makor Tana'i, that's why Shin, Nun, Tana, okay, it's all from the same place. So he meant any makor Tana'i, it sounds like anywhere where Rabbi Shimon Shezuri spoke. So why would you think to distinguish just because of Mishnah, Braita? So there's your answer. Okay, so basically, it's pretty obvious. He said, I'm not even sure why he asked the question. That finishes the Rabbi Shimon Shezuri section, which we got to, just to remind us where we are, because then you'll understand where we're going next. We started with mezuzah. Okay, we had the whole thing about what's ma'akev in the mezuzah, right? Even untithed. And then we moved from there into Sefer Torah. We were talking about how to fix if the name of God is missing in a Sefer Torah. We're going to continue with Sefer Torah and then get back to mezuzah. I just wanted you to see it in perspective. Sometimes we get lost in the flow of what we're up to. That's where we are. So Rav Zera Amar Rav Chanina Amar Rav. Okay, Rav is quoted as saying, Kera haba b'shnei shitim yitfol. What if your Sefer Torah is ripped? If it's ripped and the rip goes into 2 lines of the Torah, you can sew it. B'shalosh al yitfor. Once it gets to 3 lines, it's very classic. 2, yes, 3 already were over. Once it gets 3 lines, lo yitfor, al yitfor. You can't sew it anymore because either it's such a big rip that it'll probably tear again, or perhaps it just doesn't look respectful to have stitches going through so much of your Torah. Amalei Rabbi Zuti le Rav Ashi. Rabbi Zuti comes and says to Rav Ashi, Hachi Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah Midifti Mishmei de Rava. He quotes Rabbi Yirmiyah Midifti saying in the name of Rava, and he's going to now qualify this statement of Rav. Hada Amrina b'shalosh al yitfol. Lo maran ela ba'atikata. That's only old parchments. Aval chadetata. Here's where taf and shin switch. Chadetata is chadash. But chadash late lamba. But there's no problem with a new parchment. Okay. Now, but before we finish and try to understand what's the difference to old parchment, new parchment, right? You might say old parchment more likely to tear more, right? So don't fix it in old. But if it's new, even 3 stitches is okay. Or maybe you'd say new parchment looks nice anyway, so it's okay if there's some stitches there. Okay, unclear exactly why, but now they're going to even qualify that more. V'lo atikata mamash, v'lo chadetata mamash. Now we don't mean old and new, like how long has this parchment been around? Ela hadelo apitzan, hada apitzan. They would tan the parchment or process the parchment with gall. Okay, it was a way they used to process it. There were other ways as well. But one is, okay, I'm specifically saying one and one because we're not sure which one, and we have commentaries that say itself and the opposite. Hadila pitzan is if it wasn't processed with gall, and hada pitzan if it was processed with gall. Okay, some people say if it was processed with gall, that's the old. It's not good. Okay, it's maybe a little blacker. It already doesn't look as good, and therefore don't add too many stitches to it. It'll look even worse. So, and then the new one, which isn't processed with gall, that one is not going to look as bad. Some people say it's the opposite. If it was processed, that's the new one. That means, and the old one maybe was processed, but it's processed so long ago the processing isn't recognizable anymore. Because Tosfot, Rabbeinu Tam asked this question: don't all Sifrei Torah, don't all parchments have to be processed with gall? So there's a whole question about how to resolve that. But just to kind of give you the different opinions here, some people say that if it's processed, then it can be fixed better and it'll last better. If it's not processed or was processed a long, long time ago and it's not recognizable anymore, then maybe the stitching won't help it very much. Okay, it's more likely it'll rip again. Okay, anyway, you can explain it in many different ways here, but somehow with that they explain what exactly, whatever it is, okay, whether you go in that direction or the opposite direction. But what it means is there's 2 different types of processing, and that's what we call old and new, not necessarily old in age. V'hani mile begidin, and by the way, when we're talking about sewing, we mean with the sinews of the animal. You don't sew with regular thread. Bigradim, if you remember the gardim or the weavers, you don't sew with the usual thread that the weavers use. No, you can't sew a Sefer Torah with thread. By Rav Yehuda bar Abba, and that's thread from material, rather it has to be thread that was made from sinews of the animal. By Rav Yehuda bar Abba, bein daf ledaf bein shita l'shita mai, and we're going to end with teku. He says, what if the tear, until now we were talking about the tear covered 2 or 3 lines, and that was the decision, that was the border between when we could or couldn't sew, 2 or 3 lines. Lines means lines where there's text. What if it was in between the columns where there's no text? Or what if it was in between the rows? Let's say it's a horizontal tear where it's in between the rows and it doesn't touch any letters. So is it the length of 3 lines, which will say, oh no, you can't do it anymore? Or do we say, no, that's not relevant, because as long as it's not tearing letters, we can do it. We can sew it not where the letters are. And we don't have an answer to that question. Amar Rabbi Zera, now we're back to mezuzah. Okay, so we finished Sefer Torah, now we're back to going to the mezuzah. And we're going to talk about how we've had a whole discussion about Sefer Torah and how it's written, and specifically we talked about the last line of the Sefer Torah. We're going to get to the last line of the mezuzah soon as well. And we talked about the columns in the Sefer Torah and how long. Remember, they had to be 30 letters long, each one. And by the way, not only is it 30 letters long, we're going to see this today, but also minimum, you have to have at least 3 words on the line. How do we know that? From the 30. What do we say? L'mishpateim, 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 or l'mishpatam. I forget exactly the version of the word, but basically this 10-letter word 3 times, and that's 1 column. In a mezuzah, it's going to be different. That's where we're going to start. Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rav Chanina, Amar Rav. Again, we're going to have another quote of Rav Zera, Rav Chanina, Amar Rav. And now he says, mezuzah shektava shtayim kshera. Okay, a mezuzah that was written with 2 words on a row is kshera. Ibayelu. So now we ask. So in other words, as opposed to the Sefer Torah where you need 3 on a line, here you need only 2 on a line. Or you could do it 2 on a line, meaning you can have a much narrower column. Now they ask a question. Shtayim v'shalosh ve'echad ma'u. What if you have 2, then 3, then 1? Okay, you start off with 2, then you go to 3 on the next line and 1 on the next. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, kol sheken, of course that would be good. Shasa k'shira, you made that like the way the shira is written in the Torah. Okay, Shirat Hayam, that we read 2 weeks ago, right? It's written in the Torah now there it's in a unique form, which is like 3-2-1. Okay, it's a little different, but it's called Ariach al-Gabei Lebeina and Lebeina al-Gabei Ariach, the way we pile bricks on top of each other, right? Where they do the crisscross, right? This one's on top of those 2, and that's, okay, so that's the way the Shira is written. There's different opinions exactly about how this is written. And there's the Shirat HaZinu, which is 2 very narrow columns opposite each other. So, of course this is good. This is like a Shira. So, of course you could write it with the 2-3-1, 2-3-1, 2-3-1. It's very beautiful, so to speak. But now they're going to bring a contradiction from a source, Tanaitic source. Meitive, asa k'shira o shira k'mota psula. If you write the regular text like a shira, or you write the shira like a regular text, the Torah is disqualified. So how could you say that this works in a mezuzah? To which they say, Ki tanya hi b'sefer Torah. That's only in a Sefer Torah, right? Obviously, the parshiot that we're writing in the mezuzah, which is Shema and Bayayim Shemoah, are not shira. So they say, no, that's talking about a Sefer Torah. Only in a Sefer Torah do you have this issue of writing the wrong part, each part in its particular way and not the other way. But in the mezuzah, there's no such issue. Itmar nami, and in fact, it was also stated, Amar Rabbi Barchan, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Amar La Amar Rav Acha, Bar Barchan, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. It seems they were brothers, Rabbi Rav Acha. One of them said this in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Mezuzah she'asa shtayim v'shalosh ve'echad kshera, u'bilvad shelo ya'asena kekuba, u'bilvad shelo ya'asena kezanav. If you have a regular Gemara in front of you, you can look at the pictures in Rashi. Probably if you have a commentary, Gemara probably has the pictures as well. But it's always fun to see when there's pictures in Rashi. Okay, whether Rashi drew the pictures, right, or some later person came and put it into the manuscript of Rashi's commentary, okay, and added them. We don't know who wrote the pictures, but anyway, there's pictures. So what do we have here? You can't do it like a kuba. That's basically like a tent, so a triangle, okay, like a teepee. So it can't be written like that, where it's 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, and going down gradually, or the opposite. If you flip that triangle upside down and it starts off wide and then it goes narrow, narrow, narrow until you get to one letter and one word in the middle, can't do it like that either. Okay, why not is a good question, but I guess they didn't think that was a normal way of writing a text. Amar Rav Chisda. Now we get to the last line of what it says in the mezuzah. How do you write it? Just like we had a whole discussion about the last line of the Torah, which we said either can end in the middle of the line or has to end in the middle of the line, right? We talked about having to end in the middle of the line. And just like say a little more clearly, the issue of the middle of the line also just basically indicates that the book is over. Right? Because otherwise, if it ends at the end of the line, you might think it continues to the next page, especially because remember, it goes down to the bottom. So those who say specifically has to end in the middle of the lines because we want it to look like it's finished. This is the end. It makes it very clear this is the end. Remember, there's no periods here or anything else, or, even a period wouldn't necessarily help. It could just mean end of the sentence, and it keeps continuing on. So now, the last words of Vayayim Shamoa are Kimei Shamayim ala Aretz, right? Like the days of the heavens on the earth, right? Or how to exactly translate that is a complicated thing to translate, but those are the words. So now, Amar Rav Chisda, ala Aretz b'shita achrona. So he says it has to be on the last line, meaning, not just that we have to go down to the bottom, but what he means is those two words appear the only words on the last line. They're on their own line by themselves. Ikeda Amre. Now we're going to have two possibilities about where on the last line they're going to be. Ikeda Amre b'sof shita. It's very easy to talk about this nowadays, right? You say left justified. Ikeda Amre b'tchilat shita. And some people say right justified, because in Hebrew, obviously, left justified is going to be the end of the line. Right justified is going to be the beginning of the line. What's the basis for this machloket? Manda Amar b'sof shita. Each one wants to make a point here. If you do it at the end of the line, ki gova shamayim ala aretz. What we want to have is, remember the words, kimei shamayim al haaretz. So you're going to end with, if you're going to put those two words at the end of the line, by the way, there's also pictures in Rashi about how this is. If you're going to put them at the end of the line, you're going to have the word shamayim at the end of the second to last line and aretz at the end of the last line, and you're going to basically see, oh look, the shamayim is above the aretz, the heavens are above the earth. According to the other opinion, Manda Amar b'tchilat shita, put it all the way at the beginning of the line, is saying ki hecha de merchaka shamayim me'aretz, to show how far apart the shamayim is from the aretz. Right? I assume this is a way of saying how great God is in two different ways. One is He's above us, and one is He's so distant from us. Okay. So those are, now obviously there's also an advantage to ending it on its own line in the beginning. Even at the end of the line, it's obviously designated. It looks very different than anything else. It makes it pretty clear we're at the end here. Amar Rabbi Chelbo, Chazina le, last point for today. Chazina le Rav Huna de karech le me'echad klapei shma. The first thing he says, I saw Rav Huna, and what did he do? When he rolled up the cloth of the mezuzah, what did he do? He rolled it from echad to shma. Meaning, if you take the pasuk, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, you're going to start from the end, the left side, and you're going to roll it to the right side. Okay? That's what he's trying to say. Some commentaries say it actually, the first line of the mezuzah doesn't end at Echad. It ends in Vahayim or Vayayim Shema. I don't remember exactly. But the point is, if they said that, you wouldn't really know what they meant. Everyone knows Echad comes after Shema, and it's going to be more toward the left. So what it means is you roll from the left to the right. And Oset Parshiotas Stumot. Okay, in the Torah, there's Parshot Ptuchot and Parshot Stumot. If you have a Chumash, right, there's always the Pei and the Samach, if you know what those mean. That means, Stuma means it's a small break, and Ptucha means it's a big break. Okay, and this means Ptucha will always start in a new line, and there's a lot of space left in between. There's a minimum number of spaces. Stuma needs just a few spaces and could even start the next section on the same line, or depending on where the break is, maybe on the next line. Now, what he says is, you make the Parshiot here Stumot. It's a little bit weird why it's in plural, because there are two Parshiot, but there's only one Stuma, because it's just in between Shema and Vayayim Shema. Now, what's confusing here is Shema and Vayayim Shema are in two completely different chapters. There is no break in between them, right, directly. They're two separate. Anyway, he says you do a Parsha Stuma in between. You continue the next one a few spaces later. Okay, even you could theoretically continue it on the same line. Meitive. Now they're going to bring contradiction, although we're not going to see the contradiction yet today. We're just going to start and finish to the end of the daf. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Rabbi Meir haya kotva al duchstustus kemin daf. Okay, he would write it on duchstustus. So this is the inner part of the hide of the animal. It's not the same part of the animal that you use for making parchment for the Sefer Torah. And kemin daf. He would make it like a long. Okay, Rashi says long and short. Like short column. The column is very narrow and the page is long. Okay, but we're going to continue with him and see that he's going to say on the Parsha was Ptucha. which seems to go against here that we said the parsha, what Rav Huna did, which is the parsha stuma. Okay, we're going to finish there today. Just going to do a quick review. While I do my review, I'm going to respond to a question that someone asked before, which is, why is all this in Menachot? So I'll remind you that we started with what is ma'akev what? The soled and the shem and ma'akvin zeh zeh, the kometz and the levon and ma'akvin zeh zeh. What is essential? What is not essential? We had a whole big discussion about that. From that, we got to all sorts of other things, like the menorah, shiva kanei menorah, ma'akvin zeh zeh on daf kavchet. And then we had, the shiva nerotea, ma'akvin zeh zeh, shtei parshiot mezuzah, ma'akvot zo etzo. From there, we're going to get into the arba parshiot and the arba tzitziot. From there, the next chapter is going to continue with tzitzit and different things that are, or we're going to get to things that are not ma'akev zeh zeh, that are not essential. You don't necessarily need them all. And with that, we're going to get back to Menachot eventually. Okay? But for now, we're on this big tangent because of, this is classic, by the way, for the Mishnah, that the Mishnah has a mnemonic way of remembering things, and they strung things together not because of the content of them, but because of the same idea. What's ma'akev zeh zeh? What's not ma'akev? Like in Megillah, aim bain this and that, ella that. And we got off on a huge tangent about all sorts of. There's no difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov other than this, right? It started with aim bain adar rishon la adar sheni ella, other than. So we have all these, and then we got into there's mitzorah there. There's all sorts of random topics, tum and tara, that come up because they have the same formulation. It's really what got us here. Okay, but let's review our daf. So we found the case of Rabbi Shimon Shezuri, or at least one of two possible cases where Ravin Bar Chinina quoted Rabbi Chanina as having said this. Then we get to, we had another case of Rabbi Shimon Shezuri, or Rav Yemar said, do we hold like that as well with the tevel mixed up with chulin? And they said, yes, of course. Why would you think not? And then we got back to the Sefer Torah, and from there back to mezuzah. We talked about sewing up a torn Sefer Torah and what conditions can you or can't you. Then we had the mezuzah. How is it written? You can even write it 2 and 2, or you can write it 2, 3, 1, like a shira. Even though you can't write the Torah like that, you could write the mezuzah like that. And then we ended with the ala aretz, where it gets written, the beginning of the line or the end of the line. Again, it's on its own line. It's just a matter, is it left justified or right justified? And we finished with Rabbi Chabot saying that I saw Rav Huna, who did 2 things with his mezuzah, the way he rolled it, from the end to the beginning, right, from the left to the right, and he did the parsha stuma. And now we're going to have a question on the parsha stuma issue, and we'll get back to that tomorrow. Wishing everyone a good day.